Good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy to have you here with us today. My name is Andrea Gillespie, and on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, I'd like to welcome you to today's installment in our Race and Difference Colloquium series. Today's talk is a couple of years in the making, so I'm very excited to have Dr. Maylei Blackwell with us today. Dr. Blackwell is an associate professor in the Chicana and Chicano Studies and Gender Studies departments at UCLA, where she's also affiliated with the American Indian Studies program. Currently, she co-directs the Mapping Indigenous Los Angeles project, a digital story mapping project underway with Indigenous communities in Los Angeles. She's the author of Chicana Power, Contested Histories of Feminism in the Chicano Movement. Her research has accompanied Indigenous women's organizers in Mexico, feminist movements and sexual rights activists throughout Latin America, and farm worker women's organizing and Indigenous migrant activism in Oaxaca, California. Her current research focuses on cultural continuity and migrant civil society among Zapotecs and Mixtecs from Oaxaca, as well as the increasingly Mayan diaspora from Guatemala and Los Angeles. She's currently completing a book entitled Scales of Resistance, Indigenous Transborder Organizing with Maria Cotera and Dion Espinoza, and editing an anthology entitled Chicana, New Narratives of Women's Activism and Feminism in the Chicano Movement Era. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Maylei Blackwell.
Good morning, buenos dias from California. We're in the morning time. I think you're in the afternoon. So I'm so pleased to be here with you all. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm standing on Tovongnar, the land of the Tongva people. So I honor them as the caretakers, the traditional caretakers of the unceded territory, the stolen lands that I'm living and working on. And I know you're all coming from other traditional homelands. So I'm here to share a talk with you called Geographies of Latinx Indigeneities, Transborder Scales of Spirituality, Labor, and Gender Embodiment. And I want to thank everyone at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the study of race and difference. It's been many years we've been trying to make this happen. I have a small one here. So now Zoom is really, these are the silver linings we have to look for to survive this intense time. So one of the silver linings is I get to join you this morning. So I'd like to thank everyone who made this talk possible and the many years of patience I navigate solo parenting and academia. What I'm presenting today is part of a longer book. It's chapter 5. And I just finished the conclusion and I'm doing the final little tweaks and I hope to send it off in the next 10 days. So that's really exciting. So the book is called, let's see if I can make the screen work. Scales of Resistance, Transborder Indigenous Women's Organizing. And I just share with you some of the cases. I was not originally part of the spatial turn in academia. I began using social geography's concept of scale to describe how Indigenous women organizers I work with weave in and between local, national, transnational, and transborder scales of power to create new spaces of participation, as well as new forms of consciousness, identities, and discourse. Because my book follows each scale of organizing, I'm giving you this slide to give you a sense of the scope of the book, where each case or scale of organizing is the principle taken up in each chapter. So the first chapter is the National Coordinator of Indigenous Women, or in Spanish, its acronym is CONAMI. Chapter 2, so that's about how after the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in 1994, Indigenous women had already begun a national network that was formed in 1997 in Oaxaca. And it just celebrated its 23rd anniversary. I attended it on Facebook Live. Usually I go down every summer to work with the women, but now we're on Facebook together, which is a totally new and different world, a way of doing field work. Chapter 2 is really interesting. It's about the Continental Network of Indigenous Women, but it's about how women, when they were excluded, Indigenous women, when they're excluded from the process of organizing for the Beijing conference in Latin America and the Caribbean, they conjured their own scale of Abya Yala. It's a Kuna word the Kuna people of Panama and Colombia to mean mature land. So it's a continental scale based on indigenous epistemologies. Chapter 3 looks at how the experiences of national and what we call transnational, but I'll call transborder organizing, got relocalized into their daily lives in the states of Oaxaca and Guerrero. So what's interesting about regional organizing is that some of it predates the national organizing that happened with the Zapatistas in the 1994 uprising. So in Oaxaca, there's been a long tradition of indigenous governance, is what's called usos y costumbres. Chapter 4 is what the beginning of what I'll share today is the Indigenous Front of Binational Organizations, and it's trying to map the transborder, transregional scale that's created by Indigenous migration. And chapter 5 is the Indigenous diaspora in Los Angeles. So that gives you a little bit idea of the scope of the work that I'm sharing. I'm going to share mostly chapter 5 today. So in addition to using the ideas of geography, the book draws from 20 years of ethnographic and archival research and over 63 oral histories to examine how Indigenous women activists are navigating, rejecting, and remaking ideas of scale. The later chapters join the migrant stream. I haven't really had all my coffee yet this morning, so excuse me. And that migrant stream runs from Oaxaca, California. Oaxaca to Baja California. It's on this map, if you can't trust my words, with that, my uncaffeinated words, to California. It even goes all the way up to Oregon by now. And it examines women's roles in shaping transborder lives, cultures, migrant civil societies by focusing on the Indigenous Front for Binational Organizations, or the FIOB, as the acronym is called in Spanish. We could also update this map and make sure to include Mexico City, as maybe some of you saw the Netflix movie Roma that dealt with a Mixtec migrant worker, a domestic worker. I'm sorry, I have a little kitty who's biting my toes while I'm talking to you. I'm one of those people who adopted a new kitty during COVID, and she was in our alley being attacked by a dog, but she's super rambunctious. So let me tell you how I came to this research. While I began working with the Indigenous women's movement in Mexico in the late 1990s, I didn't work on migration until I moved to Los Angeles. I'm from LA, but I moved back home as an assistant professor, and I was approached by the FIOBs in 2005 by the newly elected binational coordinator of women's affairs, Odilia Romero Hernandez, to serve as an advisor, and later the organization invited me to design a study as part of the Otros Saberes initiative within LASA. So the Latin American Studies Association had this really important initiative on centering Black or Afro-descendant and Indigenous knowledge and epistemology. So the social movements and communities applied for the grants and then invited academics to join them. So our study was on diversity and leadership, or diversity of age, generation, and gender in binational leadership. So this is a slide of our LA meeting. That study took place 2006 to 2008. Based on interviews and focus groups in Los Angeles, Huehuapan de Leon, which is in Oaxaca, and Tijuana, so part of those 3 sites in the migrant stream, the study looked at developing gender, generational, and ethnic diversity in binational leadership. So by ethnic, so lots of American Indian folks reject the word ethnic because it's part of the project of minoritizing Indigenous peoples. And in Mexico, they do use the word ethnicities to talk about other Indigenous groups. So they, as mostly Oaxacan, they were interested in building leadership with Purépecha and Maya, other folks who had joined their organization. These are some of the slides of the studies. This is in Oaxaca, and the study was led by the woman in purple, Isentola Maldonado, one of the leaders in Oaxaca. The other academic there, Laura Velasco, is from COLEF, from the Colegio de Frontera Norte. She's wearing the camera. She's in Mexico, a Mexican academic. So our study had 62 participants in those workshops, a pretty good balance between men and women. And one of the interesting things is the greater linguistic diversity, that's the third column here, was in Los Angeles, right? So people spoke Mixtec, Zapotec, Triqui, those are 3 indigenous languages in Oaxaca, Spanish and English. So we could tell that in migration, lots of coalition building was happening between different indigenous groups. So in the past 15 years then, I've been working collaboratively in research relationships and conducted 20 more oral histories with women in Ethiopia as I accompanied them, building a leadership program called Miel, and I'll talk about that. So from that study, we met in Mexico City, and the leaders of the organization designed leadership programs, in particular one for women called Mujeres Indígenas en Liderazgo, or Miel, which means honey in Spanish. You can see, then they presented it to the Binational Assembly, so all the base members of the organization, and it was presented in this group. You can see I'm in the corner taking notes like a good ethnographer. And this session's being led by Odila Romero there in the yellow, and the woman in the black by the poster board is Mara Diaz, and she's from Tijuana. So I'm presenting this last chapter of the book based on this long collaboration that explores how indigenous mobility, community organizing, and placemaking are reorganizing the production of social-spatial relationships in Los Angeles. And this is one of the designs for Mujeres Indígenas en Liderazgo. So that kind of gives you the context of the study and then where I'm going to go from here. A map of Los Angeles doesn't tell the story of its people. Most maps of the city obscure indigenous geographies, which include sedimented layers, starting with the Tongva and Tataviam as the original peoples of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Basin and islands, who struggle for self-determination for their sacred sites. It also includes relocated American Indians, as well as diasporic indigenous peoples of Latin America and Oceania, displaced by militarism and neoliberal policies. So Los Angeles has become what Reina Ramirez calls a transnational hub for many cultures and migrant streams, especially an increasingly indigenous diaspora from Mexico and Guatemala. While Los Angeles has a rich Latinx history, right? So Los Angeles, just as a reminder from people who aren't from here, was Tongva territory, right? Gabrieleño, which is known as part of the so-called Mission Indians, Gabrieleño. They call themselves Tongva. So I try to use the names people call themselves. And this is a map that was made by a really great indigenous geographer that puts the original indigenous villages and working. So this is Yagna down, for example, and it wasn't an original village, but it was basically a work camp. So kind of like some of the debates going on about policing today, lots of indigenous people were arrested for so-called vagrancy. So they were hanging out on their own land and arrested for vagrancy. And then they were put in these work convict camps where they were basically put out to work and they built downtown Los Angeles. So but these new diasporas compel us to think about diversity within indigeneity and Latinidad in complex and comparative ways. While the density of transborder Latinx indigenous networks may be unique to Los Angeles, this phenomena helps us think more capaciously and critically about Latinidad. Hey, we're live here in Long Beach. Critically about Latinidad, as there's multiple indigenous migrations in the US, including Mayans in Houston, Purépecha, North Carolina, Garifuna, New York, Nahuas and Quechuas, and the Eastern Seaboard, to name a few. The broader chapter I'm drawing from refuses the way migration scholars fail to see so-called receiving countries as indigenous territories and nations, reenacting terra nullius as settler colonialism. It acknowledges that diversity is produced differentially by multiple colonialities and by different indigenous diasporas that may exist on the homeland of other indigenous nations. One of the unexpected outcomes of indigenous migration is that while indigeneity has historically been rooted in land-based notions of place, it's the process of being uprooted and deterritorialized and displaced, often by political and economic design, that leads some migrations and some migrants to develop indigenous identities or change their consciousness about being indigenous. So it's not that they weren't indigenous before, but how they experience it politically changes. The experience of racism, gendered migration, gender violence, economic injustice in the process of migration and within labor segmentation has led many to develop an indigenous political consciousness. Dislocation makes indigenous identity and language a matter of cultural survival, and many migrants aim to build translocal notions of indigenous place that tie themselves and their children back to their pueblos of origin, its feast days and civic responsibilities and cultural practices. So throughout the book I'm working on, I don't translate the word pueblos because in Spanish it means the village or place or town, but it also means people. So place and people, placemaking and peoplehood are tied together. So what I want to share with you today is part of the chapter examining what I'm calling Geographies of Indigeneity that includes spatialized practices of community formation and transborder politics of placemaking. To give you a sense of this context and some of its sabor or flavor, I'll map the culinary, political, and communal spatial projects and musical soundscapes of the Latin American indigenous diaspora in Los Angeles. I'll then share 2 stories of migration that illustrate the production of sacred geographies and mobile circuits of labor and shifting indigenous consciousness through oral histories with migrant indigenous women. To understand these multiple indigeneities of the city, we must disrupt the settler or prior colonial geographies of the city to understand its original Tongva or Tataviam geography as its base map for understanding and locating all other arrivants, right? So instead of using settlers, I'm using Kamal Braithwaite's concept that Jody Bird beautifully illustrates in her book, Transitive Empire, Arrivants or Arrivants, through a web of relations and responsibilities. So I use the concept of arrivant to open up the dichotomy between native and settler, to consider the conflicts, responsibilities, and opportunity to build solidarity with Native communities whose lands we're working and residing on. I'll conclude today by thinking more about what lessons Latinx indigenous migration might offer for the field of Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, or Latinx studies. And now my department just changed its name from Chicano, Chicana Studies to Chicano, Chicana, and Central American Studies. So that's exciting for us. By offering a framework of critical Latinx indigeneities, a framework I've been thinking about with other colleagues that helps me situate indigenous migrant spatial projects in relationship to these multiple settler and colonialist grammars. So what I found is for activist women of the Latin American indigenous diaspora, they navigate violence, discrimination, gendered exclusion, and racism in work, in schools, and in the city itself, while at the same time practicing the resilience and recovery of indigenous cultures. There are 16 different indigenous pueblos, so that's this slide I wanted to share with you. And one of the largest is Zapotecs, who originate from both the Northern Sierra and the Central Valleys of Oaxaca. So that would be this and this region and this region. They're also from this region, but these aren't the groups that migrate to LA per se. So Oaxaca is one of the poorest states of Mexico, where indigenous people comprise 48% of the population. And they themselves account for 53% of all indigenous people in Mexico. It should be noted that Mexico actually has the largest indigenous population in the hemisphere, although we think of other countries first because they're more dense in indigenous population. Due to a long history of discrimination in Mexico, as well as the cultural and structural dislocation of the migrant experience, Oaxacan Indigenous people face institutional, cultural, linguistic, and economic barriers that affect their life chances, from schooling to safe jobs, to the experience of crossing the border, which is often 3 times more expensive for Indigenous people than other migrants. With the added layer of gender discrimination, Indigenous women have little formal education. They're more likely to be monolingual Indigenous language speakers when they arrive to the US. So we've kind of seen the migration crisis that's been concocted under the Trump administration, and what Indigenous migration looks like, that many people who migrate don't speak Spanish or English, that they're monolingual Indigenous speakers. So these Indigenous women that I work with are shifting narratives of tradition by becoming community organizers on behalf of their own communities. So now I'm going to turn to a section called Mapping Multiple Scales of Transborder Communities and Placemaking to really contextualize the Oaxacan community. Within the Geographies of Indigeneity in Los Angeles, Indigenous migrant women navigate multiple scales even in one city. While the city is usually understood as one single scale, Los Angeles, like a county, the regions of Oaxaca, that's these regions here, I was pointing largely to the Central Valley and the Northern Sierra. These regions get remapped or recast onto the Los Angeles geography and the neighborhoods, remapping the city through multiple scales of what Jonas and Rodriguez in their work on Guatemalan Mayan migration called transregions. As we know, people tend to settle where they have family and connection, and the dense localities of belonging and kinship have meant that Koreatown and Pico Union, these neighborhoods right here, are the epicenter of migration from the Northern Sierra, while the west side neighborhoods of Mar Vista, Palms, and Santa Monica are where the Northern Sierra Zapotecs reside. So many of those folks from the Central Valleys are in these 2 neighborhoods. To scale down even deeper beyond the regions or transregions, the main spatial unit of identification for many Oaxacans is their pueblo, meaning they identify as being from Tlacalula, for example, rather than being Oaxacan or Zapotec or Indigenous. What many don't understand is that Indigenous migrants maintain citizenship in their pueblos or hometowns through civic responsibilities and traditional collective labor systems known as the cargo system. In addition, so you don't just belong because you're born there, you belong because you work collectively for the people. In addition, these political and civic duties, social and cultural responsibilities occur translocally across generations, as exemplified by one of our new PhD students, Brenda Nicolas. Her research on second generation US-born Oaxacans who learn the dances of their pueblos and perform in their hometown brass bands, but must perform back in their pueblos in Oaxaca for elders before they gain permission to perform publicly in the US. Because these primary forms of belonging, most Indigenous Oaxacans, because the primary form of belonging for most Indigenous Oaxacans is based on their pueblos back home, the scale of pueblo is recreated in hometown associations in Los Angeles, and backyard parties and events and parks, for example, that create translocal or transpueblo structures of social reproduction, of religious, civic, and social and cultural life. These geographies of indigeneity are not only mapped into neighborhoods, but into the density of resettlement that also creates microzones where many residents of one Oaxacan pueblo may live together on one block in LA or even in one apartment building. These multi-scaled experiences are largely invisible to outsiders as Indigenous communities are folded into other racial formations, wherein Mayans or Zapotecs undergo often a violent process of Hispanization, becoming Mexican or Latino. This process makes invisible the high rate of Indigenous migration from Mesoamerica that happened in Los Angeles since the 1980s, building on earlier migrations within the Bracero program that began in the 1940s in the US. Even the most ethnically and racially diverse neighborhoods of Los Angeles hold within them cultural microzones, which within the Spanish or even Korean dominated spaces of Koreatown, MacArthur Park, or Westlake here, these microzones have large Zapotec and Canjoral speakers. So I should say, and I thought I said this earlier somewhere, that Los Angeles has 250,000 to 300,000 Zapotecs living. To give you some quick examples, you can see here, like this is the second generation on their iPhone, but here at a calenda, getting ready to do traditional dance. Some quick examples of how civic, cultural, and religious practices spatialize indigeneity within neighborhoods. We can look at any weekend, at backyards and driveways and social dance halls with hometown association events and meetings, as well as local Catholic churches and neighborhood processions and celebration for different patron saints days, each several within 1 year. So some pueblos have 4 different patron saints. I thought beginning this that there was only 1 patron saint per town, but I was wrong. People like to party, basically. These placemaking practices have led even more recently to the migration of the patron saints themselves. St. Anne's, the Catholic Church on the west side of Los Angeles, now houses 7 patron saints from Oaxaca, right? So oftentimes they're in procession. This isn't a patron saint, this is just a calenda, but they're held in procession with bands and stuff around the neighborhood of the church. Indeed, consider that each hometown has its own philharmonic band. So Oaxacans are known for their brass bands. Each band is some 40 members strong and different Oaxacan dance groups. So each hometown has a band and a dance group, which calls attention to the emerging soundscape that's developed over the past 25 years that accompanies these indigenous trans-pueblo geographies. As Isaí Pasos, president of Oro, which is the regional organization of Oaxaca, a 27-year organization founded in 1988, reminded me at a community event. He told me that there's over 40 bands and dance troupes representing the various pueblos of Oaxaca, and that while only 24 are currently active and performing, their practices, performances, and fundraising and gatherings create other indigenous soundscapes and places in Los Angeles. So we can even see in the Los Angeles Philharmonic Band, many Oaxacans are actually in the Los Angeles Wide Youth Band, YOLO, because there's so many Oaxacans who are already playing. So the Latin American indigenous diaspora in LA has also engaged in digital storytelling map, where I began to marry my oral history experience with digital storytelling and ArcGIS to create Mapping Indigenous LA. The map of the Latinx indigenous diaspora community map features, for example, Normandy Park, just south of Koreatown and east of Pico Union, as well-known Zapotec basketball and community members. So this is one of the Zapotec community leagues, and this is from a town called Yalalag, and this was it was a collaboration of many researchers. This one was created by Lourdes or Lulu Alberto, who's at Utah. And this was, she has home footage on VHS and family photos. This is her dad's basketball team back in the day. You can tell because they're wearing those shorter shorts. And these basketball leagues, and Oaxacans play basketball rather than soccer because Oaxaca is so hilly, so they're basketball players. So their hometown basketball leagues ended up being the civic backbone to the organizations that started and formed the civic cross hometown organizations like the Union of Highland Communities of Oaxaca, which organized tournaments such as the Juarez Cup, and eventually Oro itself formed out of the basketball leagues as they began to organize their first Galaguetza festival in the early 1980s. So Galaguetza is a Zapotec word meaning reciprocity or exchange. And in Oaxaca, the festival is a highly commercialized event organized by the state government in the capital city for tourists. Yet in diaspora, it's a source of cultural pride and intergenerational transmission of culture and replicates the 7 regions of Oaxaca and its pueblos, each organized to participate. The growth of Guelaguetza Festival each year, even their spread throughout the state of California, means that the festival moved from the LA Sports Arena in 2002, from Normandy Park to the LA Sports Arena in 2002, drawing from 6,000 to 10,000 participants. Since then, the festival has been moved outdoors to Lincoln Park in East LA and grows, and has grown even larger to 35,000 people attending each year. Indeed, Guelaguetza has grown from a single event to something spread. Oh, this was supposed to be the slide I was showing you for Mapping Indigenous LA, to an event that's now called Oaxacan Heritage Month. That includes, so this is the mayor giving or an assistant mayor, giving a proclamation. In the front row is Gaspar Rivera Salgado, an important Mixtec scholar and founder of the FIOB. Isaiah Pasos, a member of Ordo, or what that then president, Odila Romero, and Janet, her daughter Janet. So this covers the Calenda, which I just shared the slide, which is a community procession featuring all the dancers, musicians, community members. They marched down one of the busiest streets in LA a few days before the Guelaguetza, the proclamation of the mayor's office, which I'm showing you here, a basketball tournament, an encounter of the bands, a beauty contest, and other civic and political events, like the really important Indigenous Literatures Conference. And they fund that conference by having a Words and Rhymes, a hip hop conference where people rap in Mixtec and Zapotec. These cultural forms of placemaking complement the wealth of spatial projects based on the culinary and distinctive foodways of Oaxaca that feature mole, tlayudas, and totopos. Those are indigenous foods from Oaxaca. So in addition to the brick and mortar stores, small scale entrepreneurs and street vendors produce homemade tamales, champorado, corn, blood sausage, and raspados, or ice cones, changing the face of the James Beard Award and the flavor of LA, leading a recent Los Angeles Times headline to read, "Eat your crickets. Los Angeles is the Chapulín capital of the US." So one of the delicacies of Oaxaca are pan-fried crickets. One of the dramatic spatial projects of Oaxacans also includes remapping civic and political geographies of descent. FIOB LA was one of the convening organizations of the first protest march of 2006, which grew into the May 1st mega marches for immigrant rights. These mass protests shifted the geography of descent in the city, which prior to 2006 had been organized around sites of state power like the Federal Building or in affluent Westwood, where I work at UCLA, occasionally in the City Hall or in front of media outlets like the CNN, specifically for anti-war protests leading up to the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions. But after that, after the mega marches, geographies of descent in LA started to be oriented around the working class immigrant epicenter of MacArthur Park, which is located right in the neighborhood I just showed you, which was the starting part of the March of 2006, as well as the ending point for the 2007 March, that became a space of state violence as police brutally beat up protesters and their families and journalists after trapping them in MacArthur Park. The year 2006 was particularly intense, as it was the year in which the Los Angeles community mobilized in solidarity with the teacher strike of Oaxaca, that was violently put down by the then governor Ulises Ruiz and the federal preventative police. In response to the repression, a full-scale popular movement was born as the Asamblea Popular de Pueblos de Oaxaca, or the Oaxacan Popular People's Assembly, or simply APO, its acronym in Spanish. The FIOB was one of the major political actors in the transnational communities mobilizing support and forming APO LA. Throughout the fall of 2006, protests took place in Los Angeles in and around MacArthur Park area, ending each time in the park in front of the Mexican Assembly, where eventually there was an encampment. So this is in front of the assembly. And then This is Odilia, who I'm going to talk about more. Indeed, these geographies of descent are part of the creation of a transborder indigenous diasporic community, movement, spatial relations, so much so that when reporters ask organizers how an uprising in Oaxaca was connected to LA, they responded that LA should be considered the 8th region of Oaxaca, pointing out that all 16 ethnic groups in the 7 regions are involved in the uprising, including the 8th region of Oaxaca in Los Angeles. Despite being deterritorialized, they raised funds throughout the uprising to help buy phone cards and other necessities for organizers, even going so far to transform the posada, right? The traditional December ritual that symbolizes another migration story, that of Mary and Joseph searching for lodging, into an aposada, where community members raise funds by stopping along the route, serving Oaxacan hot chocolate and food for donation for the cause. Finally, these geographies of descent are also linked to the violence of the state and the creation of pan-Indigenous solidarity among Latin American Indigenous diasporas. So this kind of echoes earlier American Indian diasporas, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But this is kind of painful and timely to talk about the shooting death of a Mayan Quiche day worker, Manuel Jaime Zoom, in September of 2010 in the Westlake District, which spurred community members to make makeshift memorials at the location of his murder by police, and gathering there for candlelight vigils. The vigils turned from a space to remember Jaime Zoom's death and a place to give testimonials as residents of the neighborhood began to speak out about their experience of regularly facing police harassment and violence. Their collective frustration with the LAPD caused death ignited 3 days of intense protests, resulting in over 30 arrests. The chief of police eventually called a community meeting to which 400 people showed up. Jaime Zoom came to the US right before the Great Recession, and his debt had tripled by the time of his murder. He lived in a small studio apartment with 11 other men. Part of this tragedy is transregional, as the debt of Jaime Zoom was incurred in order to come to the US and work, and that debt was passed on to Jaime Zoom's widow, Isabel Murraquin Tambris, in her small Mayan pueblo called Shishak. And this is an LA Times photo of Zoom's funeral. And he has an American flag and a Guatemalan flag on his coffin, and tragically, both nations had failed him. Following this tragedy, the FIOB began to conduct annual cultural sensitivity training for the LAPD and other agencies. And yeah, doing collaborative research is sometimes very challenging, as they ask me to do some of those. And when you grow up in LA, you grow up in communities of color with a very healthy, they often antagonize our communities, especially when we were growing up in protests. So, but what I can report is that police in the infamous Rampart Division, which is known for its corruption, actually carry in their pocket now a card of asking different keywords in Indigenous languages, and that's one of the victories of this campaign that the FIOP leveraged. And yeah, so it was, what's tricky is that the police weren't clear that Jaime Zoom, it wasn't clear that he actually spoke Spanish or English, so that's why the language activism started around this. But what's equally as tragic is during the Black Lives Matter protests, there was closer scrutiny, and what was revealed is that there was another beating by the same cop that shot Jaime Zoom this year. So now I'm going to share a section called Faces of Violence and move more into the oral histories before I wrap up. And this is focusing more on Zapotec activist Odilia Romero and thinking about how she's creating geographies of the sacred, one that differs a little bit from the one that's created through ceremonial sites that span northeast Los Angeles, as she became part of the Mayan Daykeepers Association. So she's a Zapotec from Mexico, but started practicing a form of spirituality that many Mayans in Guatemala practice, based on the Guatemalan Mayan calendar. I had before said that this is similar to how American Indians, when they relocated to Los Angeles, some coming as part of the Hollywood migration, but also some coming part of the days that we call relocation days, or termination, where the federal government tried to engineer, basically, save the man, kill the Indian, right? And so people were forced into migration or lured into migration in Los Angeles, and people built a pan-tribal identities together, largely around spirituality that's centered on Lakota practices. So some of this is an interesting echo where many people are beginning to practice pan-Indigenous identity, and some practice Mayan cultural practices. So I'm sharing this picture of Odilia because she has a gaze that's very strong and fearless and hard to describe. And when we sat down to do her oral history, she said her strongest memory was of Sogocho in the northern Sierra of Oaxaca, where the strongest memory was the smell of her grandmother's adobe home and what the earth smelled like after the rain. Unfortunately, painfully, some of her memories were also about the kinds of sexual violence that happen. We often hear about the kinds of gender violence or sexual violence that happen in migration, but we don't hear about how girls are sometimes made vulnerable by parents and families who migrate. So when her parents migrated to LA, they left her there in her hometown, and she was repeatedly raped by her uncles. So much so that when her family 2 years later paid for her migration and had her come to the US, she didn't remember her mother. And so she shares this powerful testimonial. And she did so, it was originally published, it was part of our collaboration, it was part of a research collaboration in Mexico, and it was published in Spanish, which means members of our community had access and could read it. Some people learn Spanish and English and become trilingual like Odilia. So she came as a 1.5 generation migrant who was a Zapotec speaker but learned English first and then learned Spanish in the neighborhood, and now she's an interpreter for courts. She speaks both Spanish, or she interprets in both Zapotec and Spanish. So at this time, Odilia was becoming very active in the growing spiritual community of Mayans. Zapotecs, Mixtecs, and Mestizos, and even Chicanos participate in with that Mayan Daykeepers. So I interviewed their teacher, Julio Puac, who comes from Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, several years to do healings and hold ceremony and train new daykeepers. And he spoke to me about the time where the earth needs her sacred portals open for ceremony. And now there's several ceremonial sites throughout LA. And that kind of opens up complicated questions about doing ceremony, even importantly, on Tongva land, right? How to ask for permission, how to have a trans-Indigenous solidarity. So another woman that I had a long working relationship with is here on the right. Her name is Montserrat, or Montse, as she goes by, Bernardino. And the section that I'm kind of just going to summarize now thinks about her training in Miel. So she became one of the leaders who came through that leadership program, and she became the FIAB statewide leader. And she's from her hometown, Santa Cruz, Papalutla, and the central valleys of Oaxaca. So they're both from those regions I was telling you about. So she participated in these FIAB organizations, and this sign, this is her at one of those May 1st rallies I was telling you about when we marched together. She says, the sign says Indigenous Oaxacans for Migration Reform. And this is some of the workshops that we did in Miel. But what was interesting is that she had a shift in gender consciousness about her work as a domestic worker. She was an organizer of domestic workers, but she also had a shift in her consciousness about being indigenous. Even though her parents speak Zapotec, she told me, it never occurred to me that I'm indigenous. I just say I'm from Oaxaca. I eat chapulines, right? Those grasshoppers I was telling you about, or whatever. I know how to make mole, and but I never identified it as indigenous. Then I began to participate in the FIAV, and it struck me, wow, I am indigenous. I also learned from other women about their histories because they had been experienced so much discrimination in Mexico, being called Oaxaquita, little Oaxacan, or little Indian, or worse, like dirty Indian. They shared how they felt and how what had been happening since they lived in Mexico. They told how they began fighting for a living in Mexico and the discrimination they suffered. So this is an important shift in consciousness in California, where Oaxacans live in large numbers, not just in LA, but 30%, it's estimated, of all farm workers live in, are from Oaxaca. And these new kinds of migrations are shifting the consciousness. There's more in this section a little bit about her labor migration and that kind of mobility, but I'm gonna kind of just start to wrap up here and conclude. So what's interesting is that these conversations about discrimination against Indigenous people by mestizo Mexicans or Chicanos or Latinos in the US are having some really interesting impacts. For example, in Oxnard schools, after suffering many years of bullying, students and families started an anti-discrimination campaign and won a victory when the school board recognized Oaxaquito as a form of racial taunting and bullying. It would be considered hate speech. So basically, taunting someone because they're indigenous. So the implication of some of this research is complicated in that it transforms US Latinidad, Latino-ness, and indigeneity, revealing the multiple layers of coloniality and indigeneity. Helps us understand how the spatial projects such as sacred geographies, the circuits of labor, which I didn't talk about so much in Montserrat's story, where she migrates all the way through Mexico, works in Hermosillo, tries to cross in Tijuana and ends up in Hollywood and works at a Hollywood, it sounds so funny, right? She lands in Hollywood and works at a Hollywood worker center organizing domestic workers after really painful experiences. Remember the movie The Help? They portrayed as in the past, but in Montserrat's experience, it's happening right now, where she was forced to live in a garage. She wasn't allowed to eat off the dishes of the family she cooked and cleaned for. So this is pushing some of our ideas of Latino-ness and indigeneity. And so I want to just conclude by sharing these slides of this, this muñeca, this doll that was made for one of the protests. We are in Indian land, legalized now. And it's interesting because it's like, yes, we're on indigenous land, but whose land? So some of this is about strategies of connection, trying to connect with Tongva people, as well as raise important questions. So these complicated conversations are just beginning to occur among Indigenous people in LA. And yeah, I think it's an important conversation that we can continue to have. And maybe I'll wrap up there. These are some of the conversations we're having around critical Latinx indigeneities. And I'll stop so we can have some conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Blackwell, for this wonderful talk. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A button. We do have some questions, so I am going to start there. So the first question that I saw, actually, I don't even see it anymore here. Oh, I see it now. It is from Francisco Santamaria. Do you have a sense of how your findings might extend to other countries, continents, hemispheres? For example, much of what you were sharing is what I observed when living in with the Tibetan exile community in northern India. You're muted.
I just noticed that. I do think there are connections, but I also think there's important distinctions. So I do think, of course, other migrant communities recreate their hometowns, their foods, where they're from. We're really familiar with this in LA. So there's Thai Town, there's Koreatown, there's Little Persia, there's, you know, there's Little India, like there's ethnic enclaves. So I think that's distinct from indigenous connections from Oaxaca, because like I was saying, their traditional systems of governance are run by town community assembly, right? So the state constitution of Oaxaca recognizes what's called usos y costumbres, or traditional normative systems. And so the way you're recognized as a member of that community is by doing tequio, or collective labor, and you're elected. So those are elected, and they're elected transborder, right? So whole systems of governance are created back and forth. And so I think that's distinct. I think it's distinct thinking about indigeneity and land, right? The connection between land and displacement. But yeah, I think the reproduction of dance and music and food is similar to other ethnic enclaves. I think there is something distinct about the high density of Zapotecs in LA, that they're able to leverage and organizing with other communities to organize the mega marches, right? The largest marches in recorded history, and shift political conversations. But we can even see, you know, Disney did a Day of the Dead, right? So movie, which is a tradition based in Oaxacan indigenous culture. So we're seeing, yeah, how Oaxacans are starting to shift even what Mexicanness is.
Thank you. The next question is from Megan O'Neill, who thanks you for this rich, fascinating research. Can you talk more about the coalition building of Indigenous people from Mexico and Central America in Los Angeles? Are these regular collaborations, or are they coming together in response to particular events taking place in Los Angeles, Mexico, or Central America? Also, are there examples of them building coalitions with the Tongva or other Indigenous people from California?
Right. So some of them are crisis related, like the murder of Manuel Jaime Sum, but some of them are long-term. So Maya Visión, one of the Mayan spiritual organizations, is a member of the FIOB. And they collaborate a lot around language justice, access to court interpretation in the hospitals, right? There was a horrible story of a woman in the South whose baby was taken away because a Spanish interpreter thought she was literally insane because she was speaking an indigenous language and she thought she was supposed to be speaking Spanish, right? So even indigenous Spanish interpreters don't understand language diversity of Mexico or Central America. So the baby was taken away from her for a while, and she had to fight for custody of her own child to prove her sanity, right? Because she was speaking an indigenous language. So Mayans and Zapotecs and many indigenous interpreters are now organizing in large indigenous interpreters conferences. So Odilia and her daughter went on to found, from this moment that I'm describing, an organization called Cielo. They were just featured in Vogue magazine. So they're doing a lot of language justice organizing with other Mayans. So there is an ongoing collaboration. Collaboration with American Indians. They're like the American Indians of AIM in LA, they come out and speak, but building the collaboration with the Tongva is slower because Tongva, there's less folks. So I think there's generally a willingness and an openness, but it's just long-term work that we were hoping that the Mapping Indigenous LA as a platform would start to build as it features Tongva stories of place in LA along with other indigenous communities.
Great, thank you. Megan has one follow-up question. How has COVID-19 affected these communities in LA and their movements and communications between LA and Mexico?
Yeah, so that's really important. So part of the work and the attention, the reason why they're getting so much attention, the organization called Cielo. First, I should say they formed Cielo because of the frustration of women in leadership. So I was telling the story of women's leadership and how like Montserrat and Odilia began to be voted in, but Odilia actually became the general coordinator of the whole organization 3 years ago and is about to step down in October. But it was a very difficult process for her, and she felt that men were blocking her her full, ability to do her job, her work. So her and Janet formed Cielo many years ago, but it formalized as a nonprofit last year, right in the height of the crisis around migration. They immediately started organizing the Indigenous Interpreters Conference. Janet had already been doing the hip hop conference and the Indigenous Literatures Conference, which were both about language and access to language and culture. But interpretation became highly important and politicized among these mostly refugee and asylum seeker cases from Central America, largely Mayan. But COVID is really critical. So they've raised their goal is to raise $2 million with Cielo. They had raised almost 800,000 last time I talked to them, but Univision took on they organized a telethon for them, El Grito, and they became the sponsors, so they might hit this. And they're giving them money to an Undocu Indigenous Fund. And this is really important because many Indigenous folks who are undocumented don't get any CARES Act. So you know how so sometimes when people work with undocumented status, they have fake Social Security, or they pay into the system, but they can never get out. They can not qualify for CARES Act and that kind of stuff. So because of COVID, it's, really critical. Most of them are service workers. So some are still frontline workers who are bringing food, delivering groceries, working at restaurants, but can't access any support when those services were initially shut down and many people are unemployed. So all those domestic workers, right? Many are not working. Some people are being really cool and still paying people who clean houses, but some people, of course, aren't offering that kind of solidarity. So there's a precarity about being Indigenous, but also being undocumented that they're addressing with their Undocu Indigenous Fund. So maybe if I stop sharing my screen, I can drop in some information about that in the chat.
Great, thank you. The next question is from ESW Randolph, who wants to acknowledge that Emory sits on land that is traditionally Cherokee. How are Indigenous languages a barrier and a facilitator between Indigenous groups? How do transnational communities use language as power and identity? How do you use Indigenous languages in your ethnographies and oral histories?
Right, so thank you for that acknowledgement. So I'm Cherokee and Thai, so I particularly appreciate that. So Indigenous language, so most folks, what's really funny is that most folks speak Spanish as a lingua franca to speak to each other. And then organizers like Odilia are actually English dominant because they came as, an 8-year-old girl. So she's the Zapotec speaker who speaks English. She's a stronger speaker of English and has cultivated her Spanish, right? So I think language is important because some Indigenous languages are facing extinction. So younger generations have been trying to make it a campaign that being Indigenous is cool, right? It's not just something that people look down upon, especially other mestizos, right? Call them dirty Indians, those kinds of things. So they've been working with Indigenous forms of hip hop, trilingual rap, Spanish, English, and Mixtec, for example. So they're using language. There's a podcast, right, that uses Indigenous language, Zapotec. There's many different dialects of Zapotec too. So what's tricky is that many, especially in interpreters, like you get called, you need a Zapotec interpreter, but they speak a different kind of Zapotec or Mixtec.
Great, thank you so much. I'm answering some other questions that I can answer via typing. So the next question is from Aya Media, who asks, I would like to know more about the large puppets. Are they part of the traditional culture?
They're part of Latin American protest culture for sure. I've seen them in LA since I was in college. So yeah, especially against the US intervention in Central America. But yeah, puppets and art are really part of US protest culture. Latin American protest culture that's made its way to the US.
Thanks. The next question is from Karen Stolley, who wants to thank you for your beautiful work. Karen is interested in how linguistic and spiritual diversity are negotiated in the pan-tribal initiatives you mentioned, while also maintaining connections to Pueblo as placemaking and peoplehood.
Right, so it's complicated because many people are actually Catholic. So the patron saints I was talking about are, their Catholic ceremonies. And Catholicism is linked to Spanish colonization. So, but a lot of indigenous traditions is part of that syncretism. Cherokees have this too, right? That Cherokee was preserved in part because of the Cherokee translation of the Bible. So a lot of Cherokees language retention was happened through that kind of missionization, Baptist missionization. So also with Spanish colonization and Catholicism, a lot of indigenous syncretic spirituality is folded into Catholicism. And then Mayan day keepers are a little bit different because they're an indigenous spirituality that's become transnational. So there is kind of those things existing at the same time. There's also a large, there are Mormons, there's evangelicals, there's a religious diversity in Oaxaca for sure, and Guatemala. So that also travels.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Youngju Lee, who asks, can you explain more about the reactions of indigenous peoples from Oaxaca towards the Hispanization of their identities in the US?
Right, so some people actively know that that's an important survival strategy, right? And so they like Oaxacan or indigenous identity is something like in the house, that you speak Zapotec in the house or Mixtec in the house, but you don't share that outside. Like we edited a special issue of Latino Studies that would be important to check out if there's a testimonial from someone from Lourdes Alberto in that special issue, who talks about like coming out as indigenous, right? Like when she wears her traditional dress or her huaraches, her sandals, things that are racialized in Mexico as indigenous, as a young girl, and what that felt like coming out as indigenous. Also school teachers who will say Indians are extinct, right? And she's like, I'm right here. And, kind of talking back to teachers and being kind of dismissed all the time. So there's some parents who traditionally really push back. There's some parents who don't teach their children Zapotec because the language of success is English, right? So there's lots of people who kind of fold into the Mexicanness, right? Even Central Americans are Mexican. In LA, so Mexicans are so dominant that it's a survival strategy, right? To not be seen as indigenous, because indigenous people get paid less money. So in the Central Valley, even work crews who are indigenous get paid, I think, 30 cents less than and so they don't say you are indigenous, get in this work crew. They say all the Oaxacans get in this work crew, all the Guadalajara folks get in this work crew. And because people don't have the same kind of language access, there's, discrimination, there's wage theft. So it does pay sometimes literally pay to try to hide your indigeneity or mix in, as it's called. And then for some people, it's their biggest fear that their kids are going to turn out as Chicanos, right? Like US born Mexicans. And so they really struggle to retain their traditions. So it's complicated in Chicano studies. Certainly some of my students identify as Chicanos with their Oaxacan because they weren't raised with those traditions, in part because their parents wanted them to do well. So, people talk about Chicana identity as not just a mestizo identity, but one that retains indigeneity in its heritage form. But there's a tension. That's what I was referring to at the end of the conversation, is that there's a tension with the idea that we're all mestizo, because in the Mexican State Project, that erases, some of us are actually indigenous. We're not all mixed, right? And so that tension within Chicano identity is part of what's being challenged by Indigenous migration and Indigenous intellectuals. So I was talking about our first generation of Zapotec PhDs that have come through this system, and they're kind of, I mean, they were, and even Mayans, you know, so Mayans are a part of, you know, Chicano student organizations, and they're Chicano studies majors, but they're expanding and pushing against some of these questions.
So complicated, and it's really important work. So thank you so much. The next question is from Francine Allen, one of our fellows, who asks about the role of women in adopting Oaxacan patron saints as part of the Catholic Church. So what role did Indigenous women leaders have in making this happen?
So I'm not a historian who's like, that's not my specialty, but women are really important, you know, as church women, because they keep it going. So, you know, part of the tradition of, yeah, so part of the debate in this Indigenous governance that I've been talking about is that oftentimes it's men who hold those cargos or those positions. But women do a lot of the labor for the patron saints and for holding up. But so that's kind of the social reproduction of their ritual labor, and that's different than their formal traditional positions of communal responsibility. So there's a big debate on, you know, shouldn't women be seen as leaders because they already do this work? And this is a big debate in this conversation around an idea called comunalidad, or communality, I guess it would be in English, that Indigenous life has a kind of communality, like your belonging is negotiated by your labor, your collective labor. And that women's labor, of course, women's work isn't seen as work. And part of that work is, you know, like if there's a mayordomo, what they call a sponsor of the patron saints, if it's a man, it's often the woman who's doing a lot of the work, right? And so, of course, you know, some people see that as a couple, we are mayordomo, the husband and wife. But yeah, so there's a debate about the amount of labor. This also comes up in hometown associations, that oftentimes hometown associations are men, led by men. But Dr. Nicolas's work is coming out now. My student who just graduated, and she's starting at Loyola Marymount University here in Los Angeles. Her particular hometown was founded and ran by women. So it's changing, and even dances and musical traditions that were led by men in Oaxaca are now being led by women. So the migration's changing things. And gender complementarity, that notion of Indigenous gender complementarity is being challenged because people are saying, yeah, that's kind of groovy, but we need to talk about the underlying structural inequality for Indigenous women. So I hope that helps to answer what I'm talking about a little bit.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is from Elizabeth Thomas, who asks, who thanks you for pointing out and acknowledging the incidents of police brutality and discrimination against Indigenous peoples in Los Angeles. It's great to hear that some progress has been made. Have you seen any indications that these incidents have been acknowledged, and whether or not this is informed and or integrated into the local Black Lives Matter discourse?
You know, to be honest, I haven't seen much of it. I think people are talking about that one police officer in particular, but it's a tense conversation even between, you know, like the kind of divestment and the broader movement that predates Black Lives Matters, for example, critical resistance. Those traditions have also been Black and Brown led. So I don't think it's so much BLM per se, the BLM leadership, but it's how people take up this moment of Black Lives Matter. That, you know, in LA, the police violence is against Latinos a lot, and a lot of cops are actually Latinos. So it's a complicated conversation. even for this Indigenous conversation. So when I did that training, what was really painful is that I was talking to 40 Latino cops who are basically talking about a form of self-hatred they were taught multi-generationally, right? So there's so many ways in which anti-Indigenous prejudice comes from Mexico, and yet people talk a lot about in Mexico how there's no racism, which is a total fiction. So it's super complicated and important. Like, we need to keep talking about this and talking about how to make the centrality of Black Lives Matter in this moment stay central, and also add our voices, right? That other people are impacted by the same forms of criminalization, right? So when people say to abolish ICE, they're also talking about abolishing the same systems of incarceration and criminalization that are at the heart of BLM. And mentors, so I was mentored by Angela Davis, and she always talks about, she was my dissertation advisor at UC Santa Cruz. She always centralizes how multiracial movements are, and even her movement against her incarceration was led by Chicanos in San Jose, California, and supported by so many people. So kind of keeping those important forms of solidarity at play, and even marking on our differences. We are differently situated. There is anti-Blackness among Indigenous and Latino folks. This is all really important to keep alive and try to do the political work we need to do to dismantle white supremacy and policing and this moment in police brutality. I'm sharing here a little bit about the Undocumented Indigenous Fund.
Great, thank you. I was just gonna make a note of that. Let's see, a question in the Q&A. So this is coming from Megan O'Neill, who says, mapping Indigenous LA is an incredible resource. Have other cities asked your team to consult with them to create similar resources?
Yeah, we get lots of requests, and even more requests in LA. There's so many different maps we couldn't do. Like, Oaxacans are so big and organized, they wanted to keep doing map after map. They wanted to do a map of the bands, and we had to, like, we still haven't launched our Pacific Islander map. So we're like, we gotta finish these other maps before you all can, like, other groups gotta have one map before you have 6 maps, right? So just, that's the complicatedness. But we have been talking to other cities. There's so many beautiful mapping projects that really center community knowledge and work with Indigenous communities. There's also a way where some Tongva community scholars and knowledge holders say, you know, nothing about us without us, that concept that sometimes even digital platforms, like, people want to be invited and in the mix in person, right? Not just that their knowledge circulates. So it's a conversation that's both useful and important, and it's just a starting place. It's just the beginning of so many important collaborations and conversations that are yet to be had.
Thank you.
But yeah, definitely other cities are talking about it, and it's important.
Thank you so much. So this question is from Barbara Combs, another one of our fellows, who thanks you for a great talk and says, I especially appreciated the insights you offer into your methodology and ethnographic practices. I heard you say that you try to listen with your heart. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that and explain what that means and why it's important. She's also an interdisciplinary scholar, and she says if time permits, she's also wondering how welcoming the various disciplines of which you are a part have been to your approach.
Okay, so I'm gonna get really real here. So I was trained as an oral historian by one of the pioneers in women's oral history, Shirna Gluck, who, you know, did a book, her first book on even like women's suffragettes. She, you know, interviewed them in their 90s. She has a book on women in Palestine. So I feel really blessed to have that training as an undergrad. And I began my research with women in the Chicano movement that became the basis of Chicana power as an undergrad. So I was doing this for quite a long time. And I noticed that I was really stuck by carrying what I perceived as the burden or the pain of their stories. And so I actually began to see an energy healer and became an energy healer. And I don't usually, you know, out myself about this because I keep them kind of separate, but I've decided not to, because it's important that learning to hold the pain of those stories was learning to let it pass through me like a river. And that's a technique and strategy I learned as a healer. So lots of times listening is a form of healing and letting people speak. So that's what I think you mean by listening with your heart. But there's also a way you have to take care of yourself as a healer. So in this moment, there's a lot of secondary trauma that happens by people who are supporting folks who have been traumatized. And so it triggers our own trauma as Black and Indigenous, BIPOC people, queer people. And so I think it's important, yeah, to take care of ourselves, to offer our critical witnessing to the people we participate with. But collaborative research is hard. There's conflicts, it takes longer. It takes a lot longer. Like I'm finishing a book I started in the night. I was like, I'd like to finish a project that didn't take 20 years. So it takes a long time, and it's not glamorous. Sometimes there's a lot of fighting, and there's organizations you work with, they're fighting amongst each other, and it could be heartbreaking as well as it's so beautiful. So I don't want to turn anyone off of it. I think it's, of course, the most important way to work. It's just important not to romanticize too, that, you know, we have to do our own work as scholars and researchers. Some people call that self-care. Some people call it, you know, individual and collective liberation. But yeah, there's a really important movement to decolonize research methods, and that's part of a movement I've been part of and want to continue to be a part of, and think about how we do this work. It's not always recognized in the academy, even though they're trying to recognize. You think, especially in interdisciplinary studies or in fields like Chicana and Chicano studies born of social movements, this is the way knowledge production is supposed to happen, in community with organizations, right? For Indigenous people, this is really important because so many years people come study our communities and basically rip off our knowledge or our ancestors and take, you know, the idea of repatriation of knowledge and ancestors is important because, like, what's the knowledge that's been produced about us isn't serving our community. So I've been really, for me, dedicated towards working with that. But, like, you know, I'm just publishing this study on Miel, and it was like 10 years ago. So there's activist time and there's scholarly time, which are totally on two different timelines. We could talk about this for a long, long time, but definitely those are some of the challenges. So part of the challenge is responding in a way as a scholar to make the immediate uses of the project, like, you know how they say, what is the historically useful, you know, conversation, like making the knowledge useful for them right now. So even Odilia is calling me because so many people are responding to that Vogue interview that they want this testimonial we did in Spanish. So I'm trying to, like, go back to, like, something we did in 2009 and get it translated and now updated in English. And, like, she's so busy, she wants to, like, call me on the phone while, you know, working from the food distribution center. And I was like, no, homie, we have to sit down and, like, talk, because that's what it requires. You know, to do an oral history, you have to, like, dig deep or have at least some space and time to breathe. And activists often don't have that. So yeah, how do we create the conditions of collaboration and being willing? So it's a long conversation. It's something I love to talk about, but yeah, I think that's what you're asking me about.
Find my reaction. I'm applauding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? We have a final call for questions. Okay, so seeing none, just want to thank you so much for this talk. We really appreciate such a fascinating talk. So I will do my applause. I know you can see me. I don't know if you can see the others, but thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing the rest of you at next week's colloquium session. So take care. Bye-bye.